April 28, 1988. On a journey across the Pacific Ocean heading to the island of Oahu, Hawaii, one of the most terrifying incidents in aviation history occurred on a Boeing 737 carrying 95 passengers and crew. Just minutes after takeoff, a large section of the aircraft's fuselage was suddenly torn apart, turning the clear blue sky into a horrifying nightmare. At an altitude of over 7,000 meters, the plane became an open convertible. Speeding through the vast ocean, winds roared and freezing air flooded the passenger cabin, throwing everyone into utter chaos and extreme panic. What exactly happened on this ill-fated flight? Would this turn into a miraculous survival story or the beginning of a tragic disaster? Join us as we uncover the terrifying truths behind Aloha Airlines Flight 243 right now. April 28, 1988, at Hilo International Airport, Hawaii, USA. At 1 p.m., the Boeing 737-297 was stopped to refuel for its 7th flight of the day. This was Aloha Airlines Flight 243, operated by a company known for primarily handling domestic flights between the Hawaiian Islands. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-297, affectionately named Queen Liliuokalani in honor of Hawaii's only and last reigning queen. This was not just any aircraft, it was one of the standout models of the Boeing 737 series, the world's most popular narrow-body, short to medium-range airliner. After 19 years in service, Queen Liliuokalani was considered a veteran, having accumulated 35,496 flight hours and completed 89,090 takeoff and landing cycles. These numbers were not only a testament to its durability, but also a symbol of its reliability. In fact, this Boeing held the title of the second most active aircraft in the world, second only to another plane in Aloha Airlines fleet. The next destination for today's flight was Honolulu International Airport on the island of Oahu, a familiar route that this Boeing 737-297 had flown tens of thousands of times before. With a distance of just about 249 miles, this was a short 45-minute flight, a seemingly simple task for an experienced crew and a well-seasoned aircraft that had weathered countless flights without issue. The captain of the flight was 44-year-old Robert Schornsteimer. With 12 years of service at Aloha Airlines, he was a seasoned veteran with 8,500 flight hours, 6,700 of which were on the Boeing 737. His calm demeanor and superior skills had been proven over years of flying across the Pacific skies. By his side was First Officer Mimi Tompkins, a talented and disciplined female pilot. With a total of 8,000 flight hours, including 3,500 on the Boeing 737, she was not only an essential partner to the captain, but also one of the airline's most accomplished pilots. Additionally, occupying the jump seat was an FAA, Federal Aviation Administration employee, there to oversee the pilots, a presence that only heightened the tension for what should have been a routine flight. The 3 flight attendants included Jane Sato Tomita, Michelle Honda, and senior flight attendant Clara Bell Lansing, aged 58, a longtime veteran of Aloha Airlines with 37 years of service, dating back to the early days before jet planes first took flight. Lansing, with her warmth and dedication, had won the hearts of passengers on countless flights under her care. This was one of the most experienced crews you could find, working on an aircraft that had safely flown for 19 years across the Hawaiian Islands. Yet today, among these exceptional individuals, no one could have foreseen that they were about to face a challenge that would forever alter their lives. Outside, passengers were boarding the plane one by one, Gail Yamamoto, one of the passengers, suddenly paused, her gaze fixating on something unusual. She blinked for a moment, but then chose to ignore it. Not mentioning what she had seen to anyone, this small detail would soon become a crucial piece in the fateful story of today's flight. Apart from that brief moment of strangeness, everything else seemed completely normal. After all, 89 passengers had settled into their seats and followed the safety procedures. The crew of Flight 243 received clearance for departure. Everyone believed it would be just another routine flight. At 1:25 p.m., Flight 243 began taxiing down the runway. The loud noise from the old engines roared as the plane gradually picked up speed. In less than a minute, the Boeing 737 had smoothly lifted off into the sunny skies. Heading northwest towards Honolulu Airport. First Officer Mimi Tompkins would be the one in command for this flight. The weather was clear, visibility was excellent, and the plane quickly reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. All three pilots were very familiar with this route. Casual conversations flowed in the cockpit, unaware that this calm was only temporary. Inside the cabin, after instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts, the flight attendants began serving snacks and drinks. At this point, flight attendant Michelle Honda was standing near rows 15 and 16, Jane Sato Tomita near row 2, and senior flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing at row 5. Immersed in the routine of the familiar flight, no one paid attention to the strange creaking sounds coming from the plane's ceiling. Little did they know, those sounds were the warning signs of the disaster about to strike. And then suddenly, the horrifying nightmare began, turning the peaceful flight into an unforgettable battle for survival. 1:48 p.m., while the plane was flying 27 miles southeast of Maui, a loud explosion, like the sound of fabric being violently torn, echoed through the passenger cabin, shaking the entire aircraft. Chaos erupted instantly. Fortunately, all the passengers were seated with their seatbelts fastened, but not everyone was so lucky. In an instant, senior flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing was suddenly sucked through a gaping hole on the left side of the plane. She was hurled into the open sky, disappearing into the void as horrified passengers looked on in absolute shock. The cabin fell into a stunned silence at the unimaginable sight. But the disaster was far from over. Just seconds later, the severe pressure difference and fierce winds caused the old plane's ceiling to completely tear apart. The small crack rapidly expanded, creating a massive hole 18 feet long from the cabin ceiling to the windows on the right side. Fragments of metal shattered and flew, striking the wing and engine, producing sparks and deafening noises. The plane immediately became unbalanced, shaking violently as if caught in a brutal storm. Luggage and belongings were ripped from their places, flung everywhere, soaring into the air in the midst of absolute chaos. At this moment, the plane had transformed into an open-top vehicle, speeding at thousands of miles per hour through the air, with the vast, endless Pacific Ocean below. After the successive shocks, passengers were pulled backward, and the thin air combined with the ferocious wind seemed to crush their chests. Everyone felt as though their bodies were being torn apart, immersed in utter chaos. The seatbelts were the only thing keeping them in place, preventing them from being sucked into the sky. The wind blew at nearly 311 miles per hour, and near-freezing temperatures lashed the terrified faces of the passengers. At this altitude, the air pressure dropped dramatically, making the air significantly thinner compared to the ground. The oxygen level in the air plummeted to a dangerous level. Worse still, the oxygen supply system malfunctioned, and with the plane's ceiling gone, the oxygen masks that were meant to save the passengers were also ripped away. The passengers were left with no supplemental oxygen to keep them alive. On top of that, the plane's communication system was completely destroyed when the wiring was severed along with the shattered ceiling. Passengers could still breathe for a few minutes without the oxygen masks. But unfortunately, some began to experience respiratory distress due to the severe lack of oxygen. Rapid breathing, pounding heartbeats, and overwhelming fear filled the cabin as their lives slipped further from their grasp. In those brief moments, passengers seated directly under the missing section of the plane's ceiling faced another danger. Sharp debris flew wildly, leaving cuts and gashes on their skin. Some even suffered electrical burns from the dangling, broken wires around them. The flight attendants were no exception. Jane Sato Tomita, standing near row 2, directly beneath the exposed section of the plane, was struck in the head by debris, causing serious injury. Her colleague, Michelle Honda, standing near rows 15 to 16, was knocked to the floor by the decompression forces, but quickly got back up, shouting to passengers to put on their life vests. Despite the danger, she bravely returned to calm the panicked passengers, a bold and courageous act in the face of peril. Back in the cockpit, as soon as the explosion occurred, First Officer Mimi Tompkins was violently yanked backward by the immense force, her head slamming into the window. In that terrifying moment, she could see insulation materials and other debris swirling chaotically around the cockpit. The sudden change in pressure created a powerful pull, as if the air itself was being torn apart. Captain Robert Schornsteimer glanced to his side in horror, realizing that the cockpit door had completely disappeared, and behind him, where the first-class cabin ceiling once was, there was now nothing but the empty blue sky. In the midst of the chaos, Captain Robert immediately took control from the first officer, struggling to stabilize the plane as it swayed violently from left to right, as if caught in an invisible storm. With all his calmness and seasoned skill, he fought to regain control, knowing that the lives of all 95 people on board were now in his hands. At the time of the incident, the plane was flying at an altitude of 24,000 feet. The immediate task for the captain was to descend the plane to below 10,000 feet, where everyone could breathe normally. Fortunately, the oxygen system in the cockpit was still functioning properly. After donning their oxygen masks, the crew tried to communicate, but the deafening roar of the wind from the hole in the fuselage rendered all attempts at verbal communication futile. They knew they couldn't restore cabin pressure, so they immediately initiated the emergency descent procedure they had been trained for in situations like this. This responsibility typically fell to the captain, and Captain Robert Schornsteimer promptly accelerated the plane to 280 to 290 knots. While not the maximum speed of the Boeing 737, it was fast enough to safely and quickly descend to a lower altitude where passengers could breathe without the need for oxygen masks. However, as the plane descended, it began to feel heavy and swayed abnormally from side to side. Clearly, the explosion that tore open the plane's ceiling had severely compromised the structural integrity, or perhaps damaged the flight control systems, as debris flew through the cabin. At a speed of 290 knots, the noise in the cabin grew even more deafening and terrifying, making it impossible for the crew to communicate verbally. They were forced to rely on hand signals to exchange information and continue following the emergency procedures. During the emergency descent, First Officer Mimi Tompkins attempted to enter the emergency code 7700 into the transponder system, which would make the aircraft stand out on air traffic control radar. However, the attempt failed as the signal didn't connect, possibly due to damage to the communication system after the explosion. She also tried to issue a Mayday distress call, but the noise from the hole in the fuselage and the violent shaking made communication extremely difficult. Her words were swallowed up by the roaring wind and chaos in the cockpit. Faced with the urgent situation, The most viable option for the crew was to turn the plane to the right, adjusting its course towards the nearest airport in Kahului, on the island of Maui. This was their only chance to save the passengers and crew. But with the plane suffering from structural damage, the question of whether they could land safely remained a haunting concern. At the Air Traffic Control Center, the controllers noticed the unusual movement of the aircraft. As it seemed to be descending rapidly towards Maui, growing concern set in, and the controllers urgently tried to contact the crew to understand the situation. But no response came from the cockpit. The silence heightened the tension in the control room with every passing minute. Realizing the gravity of the situation, they immediately redirected the call to Kahului Airport's control tower, alerting their colleagues to the imminent danger approaching Maui. A race against time had begun, but would they be able to communicate and provide landing guidance in time for the endangered flight? 3 minutes after the explosion, as the plane descended to around 14,000 feet and began to stabilize below 10,000 feet, Captain Rob reduced the speed to 210 knots. This significantly decreased the noise from the hole in the fuselage, offering a rare moment of calm in the chaotic cabin. The pilots were finally able to remove their oxygen masks and began communicating with each other more clearly. The tense atmosphere in the cockpit eased as they regained their composure. Additionally, they successfully re-established contact with air traffic control and informed them of the current situation.
Maui Tower, Aloha 243, we're in dock for landing. Descending out of 13, and we have rapid we are pressurized.
Hello, 243, clear your position. 243, the equipment is on the roll. Plane's straight in runway 2, and I'll keep you advised on any wind change.
First Officer Mimi Tompkins urgently informed air traffic control that they had suffered rapid decompression and were in an emergency, requesting immediate assistance. However, air traffic control initially didn't grasp the severity of the situation. They only called for the fire department to stand by, but did not dispatch ambulances right away, as they didn't fully understand the condition of the plane. The noise from the hole in the fuselage continued to hinder communication, causing the information to be unclear. Despite this, the plane had turned towards Maui, and air traffic control noticed the emergency code 7700 from the aircraft on the radar. Realizing the situation was dire, they continued their efforts to communicate with the crew to coordinate a safe emergency landing. Outside the cabin, thanks to the swift execution of the emergency descent, the plane had descended into breathable air in a short amount of time. The suffocating feeling from the thin air gradually faded, and the passengers began to feel more comfortable. However, panic still lingered on everyone's faces. They had survived those terrifying moments, but they were not out of danger yet. Almost everyone was praying, hoping for a miracle that would bring them safely back to land. As the plane continued its descent, First Officer Mimi Tompkins again tried to contact Maui Air Traffic Control, informing them that a large part of the fuselage had been lost. However, this information was not fully transmitted due to interference and loud noise. Air traffic control kept trying to communicate with the crew, but received no response. The prolonged silence led the controllers to fear the worst. In that tense moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath, anxiously wondering what was happening on board. Then, suddenly, a voice came through the radio. That faint sound became a glimmer of hope, bringing a wave of relief to the controllers.
We're going to need assistance. We cannot communicate with the flight attendant. We'll need assistance for the passengers.
Okay, I understand you're going to need an ambulance, is that correct?
Affirmative.
Hello, 243, can you give me your souls on board and your fuel on board?
We, 86 plus 5 crew members.
Roger, how many do you think are injured?
We have no idea. We cannot communicate with our flight attendant.
Okay, we'll have ambulance on the way.
Okay.
As the plane approached the runway, the crew had to prepare for landing. However, with the severe structural damage, they were unsure if the aircraft would respond correctly when adjusting the flaps. Captain Robert requested to adjust the flaps from level 1 to level 5, and, for a brief moment, the plane remained controllable. However, when they attempted to lower the flaps further, the aircraft began to lose control. Faced with this situation, the captain decided to keep the flaps at level 5 without making further adjustments. When he tried to reduce the speed below 170 knots, the plane started showing abnormal behavior. As a result, he maintained the speed at 170 knots, as landing at a higher speed, but with control, was a safer option than slowing down and losing control at low altitude. As they prepared for landing and extended the landing gear, another issue arose. There was no indication light for the nose gear, leaving the crew uncertain whether it had fully deployed. In the event of an emergency landing without a nose gear, it could be a death sentence for the crew. In the worst-case scenario, the plane could skid down the runway and burst into flames. Captain Robert faced two crucial decisions: continue the landing without knowing if the gear had deployed, or delay to ensure safety. But given the plane's condition, he chose to gamble everything and land at all costs. First Officer Mimi Tompkins informed Air Traffic Control that the nose gear might not be functioning. At this point, Air Traffic Control finally realized that the situation was far more serious than just rapid decompression, and they quickly dispatched additional ambulances to the airport. However, an unfavorable piece of information was relayed to the crew. Kahului Airport was not an ideal place for an emergency landing. The northern part of Maui was directly in the path of trade winds, with strong gusts that could make controlling the plane extremely difficult. The pilots had to calculate every second and every meter to ensure safety. Captain Robert requested the first officer to set the flaps at a 15-degree angle, and the first officer began calculating the parameters for landing. The safe speed, based on the runway length, was approximately 175 miles per hour. But as the captain noticed the plane's speed decreasing and control becoming increasingly difficult, he decided that landing at a higher than usual speed was the only option. The plane began to shake uncomfortably, as if it was resisting every attempt by the captain to control it. The decisive moment was drawing near. Flight attendant Michelle Honda shouted, instructing passengers to lower their heads and lean forward, preparing for the dangerous landing. She tightly held her colleague, Jane Sato Tomita, who had yet to regain consciousness after her severe injury. Flight 243 entered its final approach, but yet another issue suddenly emerged. As Captain Robert increased thrust to stabilize the plane, he realized it was veering to the left. A chill ran down his spine as he realized engine number 1 was not responding. In the tense moment, he suspected the engine had failed and quickly engaged the ignition switches to restart it. Despite both ignition systems continuously firing, the attempt was unsuccessful. Now they faced an almost hopeless situation. Part of the plane's roof was missing, the nose gear was uncertain, and only one engine was functioning. Yet, in this moment of extreme tension, the runway appeared before them. With his calm demeanor and vast experience, Captain Robert held on to the belief that he could land the plane safely. 1:58 p.m. The plane touched down at a speed of 198 miles per hour as air traffic control confirmed that the landing gear was in the correct position. Captain Schornsteimer used all his strength to apply the brakes, while First Officer Tompkins deployed the reverse thrust on the only functioning engine. After what felt like an impossible situation, the plane miraculously landed on runway 2 at Maui Airport. There were no words to describe the overwhelming relief and excitement felt by everyone present at the airport that day, from passengers and crew to rescue workers. It was as if everyone had been given a second chance at life. The emergency slides were deployed, and many passengers quickly evacuated the plane, sliding to the ground. Severely injured passengers were transported on stretchers. The crew, including both the captain and first officer, stayed behind to assist the victims until the very last moment. A total of 65 people were injured, 8 of them seriously. Maui did not have enough ambulances to transport all the victims, so airport trucks and tour vans were mobilized to take the injured to the hospital. Are you wondering what happened to the flight attendant who was sucked out of the plane? It wasn't until the situation had stabilized that the disappearance of senior flight attendant Clara Bell Lansing was mentioned. The U.S. Coast Guard spent 3 days searching for her off the coast of Kahului, but sadly, neither Lansing nor any plane debris was ever found in the vast ocean. Cause and investigation of the incident. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board quickly dispatched a team to Hawaii to determine the cause of the accident. Upon arriving in Maui and beginning their investigation, they found that part of the plane's roof structure had been completely torn off. Upon observation, the metal was ripped into a V-shape on the left side, and the right side structure was bent 90 degrees, indicating that the fracture began on the left and expanded outward, as if the plane had been opened like a can. Debris from the aircraft had been sucked into the engines, and the blades of both engines were severely damaged by the impact. From their initial observations, the Boeing 737-200 was riddled with metal fatigue cracks, along with several repair patches. They even remarked that it was a miracle this plane had continued flying for so long. After combining these observations with the data collected from the plane, they quickly concluded that the aircraft's age was the key issue. This Boeing 737-297 was designed for a lifespan of 20 years and a maximum of 75,000 flight cycles. However, at just 19 years old, its flight cycles had far exceeded that number, reaching nearly 90,000 cycles, an astonishing figure. Coupled with the testimony of a female passenger who noticed something unusual before boarding the plane, the National Transportation Safety Board quickly reached their final conclusion. In their final report, the National Transportation Safety Board clearly stated that the cause of the accident was due to Aloha Airlines failure in management. First, the plane had been overused, exceeding the 75,000 cycle limit, yet it continued operating until nearly 90,000 cycles without proper maintenance, all in the pursuit of profit for the airline. Second, Aloha Airlines failed in maintenance, neglecting to detect and address serious damage to the aircraft. Specifically, the Boeing 737-200 series required regular maintenance checks, including A, B, C, and D checks, with D checks being the most comprehensive. This is when the plane is disassembled, and each structural component is inspected to detect metal fatigue cracks or other issues. The first 737-297s were produced with thin aluminum skin, only about 0.03 inches thick, bonded using an adhesive Boeing referred to as cold-bonded adhesive, and secured with 3 rows of rivets. However, this adhesive proved ineffective in humid environments, causing the tension to focus entirely on the rivets, creating micro cracks. Boeing had warned airlines about this issue and recommended thorough maintenance checks, particularly for the tear straps designed to prevent the cracks from spreading. However, Aloha Airlines had failed to perform the necessary maintenance, allowing the cracks to grow unchecked, leading to the catastrophic accident on Aloha Flight 243. The Aloha Flight 243 accident had a profound impact on the aviation industry. The damage from the flight could have been much worse if not for the calmness and exceptional skills of the crew. Captain Robert Schornsteimer and First Officer Mimi Tompkins received prestigious awards for their professionalism and bravery in saving the passengers on that fateful flight. In 1996, a memorial was dedicated at the Inter-Island Terminal of Honolulu International Airport in memory of flight attendant Clara Bell Lansing near the boarding gate for Aloha Airlines. To her colleagues and passengers, Clara Bell Lansing will always be remembered as a model flight attendant, devoted to her work until her final moments.